The barn smelled of hay and cold and the particular darkness that only comes when a door is bolted from the outside. I was 17 years old. It was the night before my wedding, and my father had walked me across the yard in silence, opened the barn door, waited for me to step inside, and then pulled it shut behind me. I heard the iron bolt slide home. I heard his boots on the frozen ground moving away. And then there was nothing but the breathing of the animals and the wind finding its way through the slats and the sound of my own heart, which was not beating the way a bride's heart is supposed to beat the night before her wedding. I want to tell you something before I tell you the rest. I am 74 years old now. I have had more than 5 decades to sit with what happened in that barn, to turn it over, to understand it from every angle a grown woman can understand the things that were done to her when she was young, and I still do not have a single clean word for it. Not one word that holds the whole of it without leaving something out. What my father did that night was not the worst thing a father has ever done. I need to say that plainly. He did not strike me. He did not threaten me with anything beyond what the silence itself threatened. He was, by the measure of our community, a godly man, a careful man, a man who believed completely and without question that what he was doing was right. That is the part that has always been hardest to carry. I had told him 3 days before the wedding that I did not want to marry Elias Bender. Not in those exact words, because I did not have those words at 17, because the language of refusal had never been given to me, had never been modeled, had never been permitted inside the life I was living. What I had said was quieter than that and more afraid. I had said I was not ready. I had said it to my mother first, in the kitchen, while she was rolling pastry for the wedding pies, and she had pressed her lips together and kept rolling and said, "You are as ready as any of us ever are." And when I pressed further, when I said it again with something more like urgency, she had put down the rolling pin and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before and have never forgotten since. Not anger, not dismissal. Something that looked, from where I was standing, like the face of a woman who had once stood in a kitchen very much like this one and said something very much like this, and had been answered in a way that closed the conversation forever. She said, "Do not say this to your father." I said it to my father. He listened. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat still on and his face very still, and he listened to what I said, which was not very much. "I am not ready. I don't think I can do this, I am afraid." And when I finished, he did not speak for a long time. And then he said, "You will be ready tomorrow." And that night after supper, after the younger children were in bed and the house had gone quiet in that particular way, that meant the day was finished, and whatever had been left unfinished would stay that way until morning. He told me to come with him. I thought we were going to talk. I thought even then, even knowing better, that perhaps he had found some way to open the conversation that the kitchen had not allowed. I followed him across the yard. The October stars were very bright and very cold. I remember thinking that the sky looked the way it always looked, and that this seemed wrong given what was happening, that the sky should look different, that there should be some sign that the world knew a girl was walking towards something she had not chosen. He opened the barn door. He waited. I stepped inside. The bolt slid home. Before we go any further, there's something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed yet, and perhaps that wouldn't matter so much if these stories were just words. But they're not. They're pieces of lives, pieces of people, pieces of moments that changed us forever. So if you've found comfort, meaning, or even a little bit of yourself in these videos, please take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free and helps this community continue growing. And while you're here, I want to know, what feeling brought you to this video tonight? Let me know in the comments below. I sat down on the hay bale closest to the door. The horses moved in their stalls. One of them, the old mare my father had owned since before I was born, put her head over the stall gate and looked at me with that particular animal patience that does not judge and does not pity and does not ask anything. I had spent a great deal of time in that barn as a child. I had learned to milk in that barn. I had hidden in the hay in that barn on summer afternoons when I needed to be somewhere no one would find me for an hour. The barn was not an unfamiliar place. What was unfamiliar was the bolt. What was unfamiliar was the knowledge that the door would not open from the inside until someone on the outside chose to open it. I did not cry immediately. That surprises me still when I think back on it. I had expected to cry. I sat on the hay bale in the dark, and I breathed in the smell of animals and winter coming and the specific cold that settles into old wood, and I thought about Elias Bender. He was 22 years old. He was from our district, the son of a family my father respected. He was not a cruel man. I want to say that because I think it matters and because the truth is more complicated than the simple story would make it. Elias Bender was not a cruel man and was not an unkind man and was not the source of my fear. He was a stranger to me. That was the whole of it. He was a man I had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in my life, always in the company of others, always in the brief and supervised and entirely insufficient way our community permitted, and I was being asked to lie down beside him the following night and call him husband and build an entire life in the direction of his life, and I did not know him. I did not know whether he was gentle or impatient. I did not know what he looked like when he was sick or frightened or lost. I did not know whether he was the kind of man who would ask me questions or the kind who would not think to. I did not know, and I was not going to be given any more time to find out, because tomorrow the bishop would speak and the vows would be made and the thing would be done. This was what I had tried to say to my father. Not the language of refusal, the language of terror. He had put me in a barn, somewhere around midnight. I measured time by the changing sounds of the farm, the barn cats moving, the shift of the animals in their sleep. I stopped thinking about Elias Bender and I started thinking about my father, about who he was. Not the father who had walked me across the yard in silence and slid the bolt home, but the father I knew from all the years before that night. The man who had held me on the tractor seat when I was 4 years old and let me believe I was steering. Who had carried me inside when I fell from the apple tree at 7 and sat beside me while the bone was set without flinching, so that I could see that it was possible to sit beside pain without flinching. Who had read to us from Scripture every evening of our childhood in his slow, deliberate voice, pausing on the hard words as though they deserved to be held a little longer. I had loved my father. I want to say that clearly. I had loved him the way children love the people who are the whole world to them before they understand that the world is larger than those people. And somewhere in the dark of that barn, in the hours between midnight and the thin gray light that began to come through the slats, I understood something that has taken me most of my life to fully work out. He was afraid too. Not the same fear, not the fear of a daughter being handed to a stranger, but fear of a different kind. The fear of a man whose entire life, whose entire identity, whose entire standing in the community he loved and depended on was organized around a set of rules that did not have room for a 17-year-old girl who said, "I am not ready." If I did not marry Elias Bender, what happened to my father in the eyes of the district? What happened to the arrangements that had been made, to the families that had planned, to the bishop who had been consulted? My father's world did not have a category for what I was asking, and a man whose world does not have a category for a thing will do almost anything to make the thing fit into the categories he has. He put me in the barn so that by morning I would have nowhere left to go but forward. He was not wrong about the mathematics of it. When the bolts slid back in the early morning, when my mother opened the door with her face very still and her eyes not quite meeting mine, I walked out of the barn and across the yard and into the house, and I put on the dress that had been made for me, and I went to my wedding. I married Elias Bender on a Thursday morning in October in front of 260 people, in a voice that did not shake. I had learned, in 17 years of being the daughter of a man like my father, how to make my voice do what was required of it. That was one of the things the community gave me without meaning to. The ability to perform steadiness when there was no steadiness inside. I made my vows. I sat through the meal. I smiled at the women who hugged me and called me wife. And that night, in the small room that had been prepared for us in my parents' house, I sat on the edge of the bed in my wedding dress, and I waited to find out what kind of man I had married. Elias sat down beside me. He did not reach for me. He looked at his hands for a long time, and then he said quietly, without looking up, "I heard you did not want this. I had not expected that." He said, "My sister told me. She heard it from your mother." He paused. He said, "I want you to know that I am not going to ask anything of you tonight." I looked at him. He was 22 years old, and he was afraid too. I could see that now. Afraid in the particular way of a young man who has been handed a responsibility he does not know how to carry. He was not what I had built in my imagination in the dark of the barn. He was only a person, uncertain, trying. He said, "I think we should talk." We talked until the lamp burned low. We talked about the families that had arranged us and the futures that had been decided for us, and the particular loneliness of being young inside a world that does not ask you what you want. He told me things I had not expected, that he had also felt railroaded, that the arrangement had moved faster than he was comfortable with, that he had thought about asking for more time and had not known how. I told him about the barn. I told him slowly and without knowing how he would receive it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He should not have done that." Those 5 words, I have carried them for 57 years, not because they changed what my father had done or undid the night I had spent in the cold, but because they were the first time in my life that anyone had said plainly that what had happened to me was wrong, not a spiritual test, not God's will working through an imperfect vessel, wrong. I did not leave Elias. I want to say that, and I want to say what came after it, because the story does not end in the barn, and it does not end in the wedding, and it does not end in that first conversation beside the low lamp. What came after was a marriage, a real one, built the way real things are built, slowly, imperfectly, out of the materials available, which were 2 young people who had been given no map and very little language, and who had to invent between them, quietly and without permission, a way of knowing each other that the community had not provided. We were married for 31 years before Elias died. We had 4 children. We farmed the land his family had worked for 3 generations. And inside all of that, inside the daily life of a plain marriage in a plain community, we built something that I think of now as our private country. A place with its own customs, the habit of asking, the habit of answering honestly, the long evening conversations that our neighbors would not have understood, and that we never spoke of outside our own walls, because what you build in the private country of a marriage belongs to the 2 people who built it. My father came to our home every Sunday for the first 10 years of our marriage. He sat at our table and ate what I made and spoke to Elias about the farm and the weather and the matters of the district. He never spoke of the barn. I never raised it. That was a kind of agreement, wordless and unconsented to, the kind that families make when the truth would cost more than either party is able to pay. I accepted it the way I had accepted many things, by putting it in a place I did not visit often and going on with the living. When I left the community, 12 years after Elias died, I finally stopped accepting it. I am not going to tell you that I found peace with my father in some clean and final way. I am not going to tell you that I understand now and have forgiven, and that the story has resolved itself into something whole. The story has not resolved. I am 74 years old, and the story is still going, the way real stories always go, on past the point where you expected them to end, into territory that does not have names yet. What I will tell you is what I know. My father believed he was right. He believed he was acting in love, which is one of the most dangerous things a person can do. Act in love without asking the person they love whether the action is wanted. The barn was love in his language. The bolt was love. The cold and the dark and the sound of his boots walking away, all of it was love in the only dialect he had been given, and the dialect was wrong, not the love, the dialect. I have spent a long time trying to separate those two things, the love from the dialect it came in. Some days I can, some days I cannot. Both are true. A thing can be love and still cause damage. A person can act in love and still be wrong. Understanding this has been the work of most of my adult life, and I am still working on it, and I think I will be working on it until I am finished. What I know for certain is this. The night I spent in that barn was not the end of me. I walked out in the morning, and I walked into a life that became, in spite of everything, more mine than I had expected it to be. Not because the community gave me that, not because my father gave me that, because Elias Bender sat down beside me on the edge of a bed and said, "I think we should talk," and because something in me that was still alive despite the barn, still reaching despite the bolt, said yes. If you have ever had your voice taken from you by someone who believed they were doing it for your good, I see you. If you have ever stood in a barn or a kitchen or a small room and felt the weight of a world that had decided for you, I see you. If you have ever walked out of a locked place and had to build something real from whatever was left, I see you. And I want you to know that walking out is not the end. It is only the beginning of finding out what you are made of. You are made of more than they knew. You always were. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are millions of videos you could have watched today, yet you spent these moments here. But there's one thing I noticed recently. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone, somewhere, or some feeling you thought you had forgotten, I hope you'll subscribe. It's free, and it helps these stories continue. And before you go, tell me, what part of this story stayed with you the longest? I'd love to read your thoughts below.